This is entry number 53, and it's dated Friday, August 21st, 1964. This is 2 pages. What is this last entry about?
Well, it basically deals with a commission meetings and schedule. There is indication here that the commission considered Chapter 4, which was the chapter dealing with the case against Oswald, and apparently approved it without much debate, reporting to Rankin that, and Rankin reporting to us that they thought it was basically factual in nature and there was not much controversy in it. And I thought that it was more likely than not that this chapter would be the subject of extensive controversy once it was released by the critics of the commission. And subsequently, there was still talk about presidential protection and how to handle that, but we've already discussed that ultimately the 7 members agreed with Secretary Dillon's proposal. So the only other matter there is that the Rankin did tell us that he'd gotten the 2-week extension of the release date, which now became September 24th, and that Lee Rankin had emphasized to the White House that he was requesting this extension primarily because of the needs of the commission members to give this report the attention that it deserved. And Rankin made it clear that no preliminary view of the report, whether in galley proofs or otherwise, was going to go to the White House. The commission already decided that was not going to be done. Rankin was also aware of the archives issue that I discussed earlier and recognized it would need additional attention. And as I've indicated, that attention was subsequently provided in January of 1965.
There is one sentence I want to read. There is apparently a feeling among the members of the commission that it would be desirable if all the material of the commission were not available to the public for a year or 2 after the report comes out. What was the discussion as far as delaying it a year or 2?
Well, as I tried to explain this, it's basically the human instinct of wanting to defer as long as reasonable the attack that you knew is coming. But no changes were made either in the release of the report or in the release of the underlying documents and the 26 volumes because of this concern. Basically, although people might have preferred a period in which they could luxuriate in the favorable treatment of their work before the avalanche of criticism, things had to just develop on their own course, and the commission made no efforts to defer publication of the supporting volumes.
So the journal concludes here August 21st, a little over a month before the final report is released. Why did the journal stop here?
Well, I think the journal probably stopped here because I had become so involved in reviewing and rewriting and conferring that I didn't feel I even had the time, the 5 or 10 minutes it might take to dictate a meaningful paragraph or 2 about what I was doing. And in fact, I think the reader of the journal gets the sense of how Norman and I and Rankin worked together with the materials going back and forth as a process that worked for us and got chapters to the commission in a timely and now orderly fashion. So the fact that this entry refers to approval of Chapter 8 indicates that in fact it's essentially completed so far as the commission is concerned. So there were some important issues that remained open at this time, and they would have found their way into the journal if I had continued the journal, but perhaps we could talk about a few of those here now.
Yeah, that's a good idea. In light of the no real conclusion to the journal, there are a few threads hanging, one of which is Marina Oswald. She ended up being called back a couple of times. Let's talk about her and also how her story has maybe evolved and your thoughts on that.
I know late in the day, Marina Oswald discovered and reported to the FBI or to the commission that she'd found a copy of the bus ticket that Oswald had used, I think, on his return trip from Mexico City, and it was in a book that she had taken to a hotel when she'd been put in a hotel immediately after the assassination. In any event, 3 members of the commission went to Dallas to interview her. It included Senator Russell, And it was a very interesting interview. And as a side comment, I think anyone who reads the transcripts of the interview of Marina Oswald will come away with an impression quite contrary to that which Stone described in his movie. They were uniformly courteous, deferential, polite, and sympathetic, and to a degree that you might not have expected of men of that experience and stature. In this particular interview, what I thought was significant was, first, there was some extended conversation about their life in Russia, and it's when she revealed sort of how he liked to go to concerts and read books, and that he had some Cuban friends who told him that, in fact, Cuba was becoming more like Russia and more authoritarian than they preferred, and it was sort of a negative view of Cuba, which was of interest given what we know subsequently resulted with Oswald making an effort to go to Cuba or through Cuba, since we're unclear exactly what his intentions were. And also there was an effort to elicit more information about her assessment of her husband. And in one very poignant moment, when she was asked about this, she commented about the fact that her husband had never been satisfied in the United States, so he went to the Soviet Union. He was never satisfied with the Soviet Union, so he sought to return. According to her, he probably would not have been happy if he'd been able to go to Cuba, and might have been happy only on the moon. And the Senator Russell at one point asked, well, was he a good husband or a bad husband? And she said, well, he's a good husband when he helps in the kitchen and with the children, and he's a bad husband when he beats me. And it became clear in this interview and others, and that the abuse was more frequently than once or twice. And so that was, I thought, revealing, and I think, she's a smart woman. But I think those three members of the commission, I think, came away feeling, after all that they heard, that she was not an enemy of the people. She was not an agent of the Soviet Union. She was a very young woman who made a terrible mistake. And she had tried, they think, and I concurred in this, to cooperate and tell what she could remember, and clearly evidenced her inability to remember some things, to the satisfaction of the commission. I think that the people who wanted a separate section on Marina, there would have been some purpose to sort of consolidating all of that together, but we weren't doing that for any other witness, and it would have been sort of hard to fit into the organization we already had for the chapters. So different members of the staff drew on her testimony for different reasons, whether you're dealing with the conspiracy theory or his conduct on the night before he went to Dallas with the rifle in the package. So in any event, I think most of the staff accepted the decision to not have a separate treatment of her in the final report. And the other issue that came up in the last month, and indeed in the last week or 10 days, was that Jim Liebler, who became a close friend over subsequent years, wrote at least 3 or 4 detailed memoranda late in the day after he had had an opportunity to review, in some instances, galley proof. So he submitted to me comments on Chapter 4, dealing with Oswald as the assassin, comments on Chapter 6, and I forget what other chapters. But each of the memoranda was very detailed, with 40, 50, 60 comments, and very specific, suggesting that this section was too long, or the caption was improper, or it could have been worded differently, or this fact was wrong. And I undertook the burden, as I had to review them all and decide what changes should be made in the chapters that Jim was critiquing. And Jim was, extraordinarily bright, very aggressive in his comments, very boisterous in his behavior, but a very skilled writer and editor. And in fact, Rankin at one point had told him that, if there's any writing to be done in the future, I'm going to ask you to be an editor. So what I tried to do when I wrote my book was to try to quantify the number of suggestions and roughly conclude what I did. And I forget the particular specific steps, but the most important point was that if there was any comment by Jim that altered the substance of the report or the specific chapter in a meaningful way, the change was made. I found several of his comments had been already handled by subsequent revision. A significant number were simply complaints about excessive writing of many of his staff members, that he would have argued for shorter sections, and those were matters simply too late to address, given the matter of printing in those years. And some suggestions were consistency, for example, trying to not call her Marina some places as Mrs. Oswald other places, but to standardize the words that were being used. And in some cases, finding a factual error that could be corrected, and not on a major matter, but whether it was major or not, if it was a mistake, we corrected it. So I think I ended up trying to find comfort in the fact that I'd read his materials carefully, respected his judgment, made many changes based on his recommendations, and denied making some objections because they were matters of judgment. And if we had previously decided to evaluate something in one way, the fact that he would have preferred another way didn't justify accepting his interpretation rather than the one that found his way into the draft that he reviewed. So I think Jim, if questioned, would say on the whole he respected my judgment. He didn't agree with all my decisions, but it didn't keep us from agreeing that the material should be published, and it didn't prevent us from becoming close friends in future years.
Comment on the way in which his memos have been used by members of the research community to express dissension in the ranks or try to show that a staff member had major concerns with the report.
Well, I mean, you could call his concerns major, but as I would say, they didn't really pertain to major conclusions. It was more or less a way of expressing and describing the evidence and the rationale based on the evidence. I think what's most important in response to that concern is that Jim Liebler was one of the most articulate, forceful supporters of the Warren Commission reports. In the last chapter of my book, I cite the many occasions on which Jim stepped forward to participate in debate. And I recall one where he and Joe Ball debated against Elaine and Edward Epstein, who had written a book critical of the commission based on interviews that he had had with members of the staff. And in the course of that debate, whereas Joe Ball was very polite and professional in dealing with the subject matter, Jim Liebler made it clear and said outrightly that Mr. Lane is in the business of telling lies in order to make money, and that if he wants to sue me for libel, I'm ready to take the papers and proceed accordingly. And of course, Lane never challenged Liebler and was well advised not to. But in any event, so there's a sharp difference between disagreeing with the report and making substantial changes at a time when changes could be made in the way in which the report dealt with particular subjects.
Before we get away from Marina Oswald entirely, this may be difficult for you to really comment on, but we've discussed it before, that over the years her story has changed. I think she gave her last public interview around 2003 after she had worked with Oliver Stone on the JFK film and done some work with other researchers who have written books that promote a conspiracy. And as I recall, her last public statement on the assassination was essentially that she believed her husband had been framed, that he did not shoot anyone on November 22nd, 1963, which is obviously in stark contrast to her testimony before the commission. Do you have any thoughts on this evolution of her story, or is there any way you can comment on that?
Well, my comments are few and sad. I think nothing that she says today or said 15 years ago in any way impeaches the testimony that she gave under oath on 4 occasions during the Warren Commission's investigation. And I think that she deserves some respect because of the horrific experience that she confronted so early in her life. I think she has been a sterling mother to 2 daughters who grew up under these circumstances in Dallas. Although their name was changed to Porter when she married, and I think Mrs. Porter deserves to live her life, and that people trying to make use of her for their purposes, I think, should be embarrassed in so doing, and that's basically where I stand.
The single bullet theory. No other aspect of the commission's work has probably been more controversial, and even in the last days of the commission, it became a subject of some debate. Let's talk about that. Yes,
as we had discussed earlier, that there was finally agreement on a reenactment to be conducted in Dallas, and it was done. I forget in May, I believe, and it was very precise in what it hoped to accomplish.
Page 167 is where you talk about the reenactment, May 24th of 1964.
Right, and the Secret Service had provided a follow-up car that was not the presidential limousine, but similar in design, and what the commission staff was trying to do was trying to make some assessment on the probable time range within which the first 2 shots occurred, the timing of the 3rd shot, and the location of the car at the time, and basically looking at the film with a view as to when Connolly was shot, and so forth and so on. I guess the end result was that they were able to locate the timing of the shots with respect to the location of the car in a way that when the Secret Service personnel and others looked through the scope, it was quite clear that Connolly was aligned in front of the president, slightly lower because of the 3-inch difference in the seats, and slightly to the left because of an additional 6 inches from the side of the car, and that there was no reasonable explanation for the impact on Connolly coming from the shot that exited the president's throat. In other words, the situation of the limousine during the time frame when Connolly believes he was shot does support the proposition that he was the second injured person from the shot that first hit the president. And to some extent, what he recalls about the sound of the shot is quite realistic, and it coordinates with the facts of life, namely that the first shot is probably the one he heard and missed, and a shot that missed the car, and that it was the second shot that injured both him and the president. So there was no doubt, of course, when the third shot was fired. So the participants in the reenactment, whether they were members of the staff or of the agencies, were all fully satisfied that they had addressed this issue, and that in fact the earlier findings about there being 3 separate shots, each of which hit someone in the car, which had deficiencies from the very beginning in terms of where the shots were and where the fragments of the bullets were, went away confident that the commission could find that the single bullet theory was not only the best, but in fact the only interpretation of the wounds and the shots that was consistent with the facts on the ground. And when that report of that came back to our office, of course, we were pleased with the result, and because obviously Rankin and the staff had taken quite a burden on themselves in pursuing so aggressively the need for such a reenactment. So the results of their advocacy had yielded some very important findings. As a result, the relevant chapters of the book, chapters 2 and 3, or wherever else the shots were mentioned, the single bullet theory is set out, and the conclusions from the reenactment are stated quite clearly in the chapters of the book where the matter is addressed. So, but when the findings and conclusions were put before the members of the commission for final approval, Senator Russell was troubled by the single bullet theory because he tended to rely on Governor Connolly's conviction, notwithstanding the reenactment, that Governor Connolly, had been hit by a separate bullet. There was no changing Governor Connolly's mind then or for many decades to come. And of interest, we have a recorded conversation between Senator Russell and President Johnson during the very same period when the commission is concluding how to state its conclusion with respect to the injuries suffered by the two occupants of the limousine, and which shot resulted in which injury. And he told the president that he was inclined to dissent from any finding that the same bullet had hit both the president and Connolly. And he complained to the president that he was being asked to agree to something that he thought was improbable, because Governor Connolly thought it was improbable.
It should also be mentioned, I mean, I assume it might be connected, that you said earlier Senator Russell probably attended fewer meetings of the commission than any other member, was less engaged because, in part because he was opposing all the civil rights legislation that summer. But would you say that his attitude towards the single bullet was maybe not as informed as that of other commission members, perhaps?
Well, not only perhaps, but almost certainly.
Okay. I was being more diplomatic.
Yes, and you were, and you're entitled to be diplomatic. So the real problem was that the Chief Justice, of course, wanted a unanimous opinion, and what the Chief Justice did was to try to work out a compromise, and I'm looking for the relevant a portion of the conclusions. He looked hard at the arguments pro and con with respect to what the CIA and the FBI did, and those investigations revealed to me a very important amount of information about what we had missed, in the sense of the failure of both the CIA and the FBI to bring to bear the resources each agency had that had important knowledge, for example, with respect to anti-Castro groups in the United States, which indeed were conducting armed adventures against Cuban forces with the aid of United States agencies. So information of that kind, which became public with the Church Committee, was information that clearly would have influenced the breadth of the investigation by the Warren Commission.
You named your book "History Will Prove Us Right," which is a quote by the Chief Justice. I'd like you to explain that. The Chief Justice, more than anyone else, of course, is associated with the Warren Commission because it bears his name and he's forever intrinsically linked to the Commission. Tell us about this quote and how he treated critics over the years to the Commission's findings.
The Chief Justice wanted to treat the report like a judicial opinion. It stands for itself, and you don't examine the background of how it was produced. So he was really quiet on the subject completely until the Drew Pearson column was produced in 1967, reporting on these Castro assassination plots that were being discussed within the CIA, and he had to consult with the President Johnson about this subject, and in the course of that educated President Johnson in the findings of the commission, which was obviously a useful thing to do. But so the Chief Justice had never spoken out, but he did speak out, I think, on that occasion, and he spoke out in his memoirs about the experience, and did say that based on his own prosecutorial experience, if the Oswald case had come before him, it would have been a 2 or 3 day murder trial, and that would have been done with the case. And that was also Bugliosi's assessment as a prosecutor, that it was essentially a very simple case given the volumes of evidence identifying Oswald as the assassin. So in the early years, the Chief Justice was assuring people that the report should stand on its own, and he received a call from Joe Ball, his close friend from California, who complained about the volume of criticism of the work of the commission. And the Chief Justice reportedly told Joe, "Be patient, history will prove us right." And so I think if I had been bolder, I would have suggested a title of "History Has Proven Us Right," but I had to have at least some caveats associated with the book. There was this kind of reservation, and the fact is perhaps due to Senator Russell's limited attendance. It may be that he never really focused on this issue until the meeting of September 18th. So, but there should have been, given the importance of this, an effort to focus on this, very early, at least promptly after the reenactment, one would think, and when the staff was prepared to advise by memoranda or in person exactly what had been done at the reenactment and what conclusions could be supported based on that investigation. If that had been done in late May or June or July, when they began to consider the list of findings that the Chief Justice was eliciting based on his set of questions, it would have at least identified reservations, if any members of the Commission had such reservations, in which event the staff could have been utilized in a meaningful way to educate the members accordingly, and that would have avoided this. That is what Hoover would say is a Monday morning quarterbacking. Yeah. But it is, in retrospect, a failure of us all to sort of understand the level of acceptance within the Commission of certain of the more important findings of the investigation.
I want to go ahead and move along in time. You write in your book a large section called The Aftermath, and we won't be able to take it page by page, but I would like to kind of go through it in a little detail. This is chapter 10 of your book, which starts on page 293, and it runs quite some time. It goes all the way to 350. And so it really covers, after the report came out, the immediate response to it. What I want to first touch on is we've mentioned several times information that was withheld at the time from the Commission by the FBI and the CIA, which came to light in the 70s. Give us a sense. I know we had the Rockefeller Commission. Give us a sense of, as this information trickled out, how you felt about it.
Well, I think we all felt, members of staff, very, very upset and disturbed by the disclosures in the middle 1970s of a wide variety of information. This was the time, of course, when we learned about the Hosty note that had been destroyed, and that was so important to determinations as to Oswald's complicity in any conspiracy. It was a time when Hoover's disciplinary efforts were revealed and indicated he had lied consistently with respect to the investigation that his office or agency had conducted. And the CIA disclosures came before the Rockefeller Commission, where David Bellin, our colleague on the Warren Commission staff, was the executive director. And once his commission received a full written report that had been prepared by the CIA in the early 70s, and he wanted to have hearings on it to make it public. And eventually he was overruled by Rockefeller on direction from Kissinger and the president. So that detailed information did not come to the public before the church investigation in 1976. And that agency also had in-depth investigations of the extent to which the FBI and the CIA had assisted the commission, or more accurately, had failed to use their resources to assist the commission in many important areas.
This obviously was disappointing to you, but at the same time, the commission can't be faulted for not utilizing information it didn't have or didn't know existed. In the midst of this, there's this sort of growing disenchantment, I suppose, with the findings of the commission, in part because of perhaps the frustration and violence of the latter half of the 60s, and then we're going into the Watergate era, where there's a growing mistrust of the government. Give us a sense of the time period. You went through this as the findings of the commission were frequently challenged by books and movies and documentaries. How did this impact you?
It impacted me in the sense that I care deeply about the Warren Commission work that I had participated in, and I continued to support its conclusions. And I was ready to accept some modest criticisms of the way we handled problems, but I was reassured by the fact that when important areas of our work were professionally challenged, our conclusions were, without exception, validated. For example, much of the early criticism did arise from the failure to make the autopsy materials, or at least some of those materials, available to the witnesses before the commission and available to the public. And as a result of that continued challenge to the findings of the single bullet theory, which it was based in part on the nature of the wounds as examined by experts, eventually there was enough pressure that the Attorney General then, Ramsey Clark, decided to convene a panel of forensics experts to examine these materials and issue a report evaluating whether the commission's conclusions were justified by the autopsy reports. The Attorney General, whom I knew not well, but we had overlap to some extent in the department, called me and asked whether I thought that was a good idea, and I'm sure he called many other people, and I said, by all means, let's do it. And he did it, and the panel of 3 or 4 experts issued a report and made public confirming the conclusions of the Warren Commission. There were subsequent investigations by forensic experts under the auspices of the Rockefeller Commission in 1975 and under the auspices of the Select Committee in the House in 1978 and 79. So without exception, well, let's be more accurate, with only a single exception, every forensic expert who's examined the materials has agreed with the Commission's findings. The only exception was Dr. Wecht, who to this day has maintained that it was impossible to have a single bullet commit and produce the injuries of both men. But his position, I think, has been found very little support for those people who look hard at the facts involved and how the occupants were located in the car. And when asked under cross-examination by Bugliosi in 1986 at a moot court of a prosecution of Oswald, where Bugliosi was the prosecutor and Jerry Spence was the defense counsel, Wecht took the stand to challenge the single bullet theory, and when, after some give and take, Bugliosi said, well, Dr. Wecht, what happened to the bullet that exited the president's throat? To which Wecht could only say, well, I don't know, I didn't conduct the investigation. So in fact, there was no explanation, and Bugliosi was able to argue to the jury that it was Dr. Wecht who had the magical bullet because it disappeared into the air as soon as it exited the president's throat.
I want to go back to the spring of 1975 for just a moment. You write in your book that after the Zapruder film was shown on television for the first time, so a nationwide audience finally got to see the film in motion outside of the still frames published in Life magazine, you write, a whole new wave of Warren Commission critics and conspiracy theorists urged a new investigation. That, of course, became the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and their work over the course of several years in the late 1970s, essentially, with the exception of the acoustics evidence, which is its own entity and very controversial, would you say that the House Select Committee validated the work of the Commission?
I would say that, but I don't think the chairman of the commission or the general counsel would say that. But in fact, the select committee did some very fine work. They used technology that was not available to Warren Commission. They had some imaginative work done on the photographic side and on technical issues with respect to approaching the issue about where did the bullets come from and so forth. And they enlisted the help of some very prominent people, and their conclusions and discussions were very professional. But it is true that with respect to the essential findings, namely that the shots from that injured the president and the governor came from the depository, the fact that Oswald was the shooter, and the fact that there was no apparent conspiracy in which he was involved, all were endorsed by the Select Committee on Assassinations. The Select Committee did set out initially to impeach our work by maintaining that all of us, including the 3 members of the commission who were still alive, had not had a sufficiently impartial professional assessment of our job. The Katzenbach testified, 8 of us from the staff testified, and the 3 commissioners testified. And we all were asked, well, were you not under pressures, political or timely, which prevented you from taking an objective look? And each one of us denied that as vigorously as we could, but our denials were passed over as unacceptable, and we were faulted on those grounds repeatedly in the report. But as you suggest, on the matters of substance, with respect to our conclusions, the Select Committee was required to endorse and validate our conclusions. One of the interesting and somewhat minor aspects of that committee's work was that with respect to conspiracies, they would deny that there was evidence of a conspiracy, say, by organized crime or by the Teamsters Union or by the foreign agencies. But they often would say there was no evidence, but the evidence that cannot successfully preclude the possibility that some individual might have done something in the future. The idea that you need a level of evidence which will persuasively deny the option of any individual acting independently, of course, is a standard that's not used in any kind of legal proceeding, and when you think about it, it's truly foolish. And that was sort of a way that the Select Committee tried to protect itself from conclusions that an organization was not involved, but that does not preclude, they said, the possibility that a member of that organization might have taken some illegal action. In any event, it was troubling, but the more troubling point was, of course, the acoustics evidence, which arose in the late days of the commission, and about which much has been written. But the most important point is that although it was terribly wrong for the committee to change its conclusions so late in the day based on untested evidence of that importance, but that within a few years afterwards it was examined by a panel under the auspices of the National Academies, and it was found that the 4 sound waves that were assumed to be shots, including one from the grassy knoll, were in fact sound waves that occurred 60 seconds after the actual assassination.
It's still evidence that is studied and debated about today, although you are quite right that there was a strong criticism of it just a couple of years after the final report of the House Select Committee was published. Was it insulting to you to have a congressional committee essentially try and tarnish the work and reputation of the commission? You know,
I practiced in Washington for many decades, and I dealt with many important and controversial matters, and I was used to having my participation or product criticized. So I was offended, particularly in light of the fact that I think anyone who's been in private practice and advises clients about alternative ways to treat a threatened prosecution or some other matter of serious import is that it's the counsel's responsibility to make sure that the client understands exactly the risk associated with any of the available alternatives. An assessment of risk and balancing that risk against the benefits is something that lawyers do routinely when they're dealing with matters important to the management of a corporation or the outcome of a legal proceeding. And I think that kind of professionalism was not brought to bear in the handling of the acoustics evidence, and the fact that several lawyer members of the committee wrote eloquent and persuasive rejections of the evidence, I think was a clear indication to the staff, as far as I'm concerned, and to the chairman, that they should not undertake a course of action that has so many unaddressed questions and would taint the entire work of the report. And that's in fact what it's done. I mean, Bill Yossi has a lot to say favorable about the select committee, but says that their eagerness to show some positive and dramatic result overcame their sense of reason and discipline in reaching the conclusions that they did on the acoustics evidence.
There was definitely in the late 70s there a public assumption that there was a conspiracy and that that's what the House Select Committee was going to find. Do you think that that sort of public pressures helped to influence the decision? I
think that any congressional committee is subject to pressures that are different from similar challenges, shall we say, in a non-governmental context. I mean, they're under public scrutiny all the time. They're expending public funds. They want to demonstrate there's some positive outcome to their funded efforts. And so the pressures weigh heavily on finding results. And so the discipline in looking at possible outcomes in terms of risk and validity and professionalism are, not the kinds of things you look for in congressional committees. I think in sharp contrast, Senator Church conducted those committees in a much more disciplined fashion. He looked hard at the arguments pro and con with respect to what the CIA and the FBI did, and those investigations revealed to me a very important amount of information about what we had missed, in the sense of the failure of both the CIA and the FBI to bring to bear the resources each agency had that had important knowledge, for example, with respect to anti-Castro groups in the United States, which indeed were conducting armed adventures against Cuban forces with the aid of United States agencies. So information of that kind, which became public with the Church Committee, was information that clearly would have influenced the breadth of the investigation by the Warren Commission.
You named your book "History Will Prove Us Right," which is a quote by the Chief Justice. I'd like you to explain that. The Chief Justice, more than anyone else, of course, is associated with the Warren Commission because it bears his name and he's forever intrinsically linked to the Commission. Tell us about this quote and how he treated critics over the years to the Commission's findings.
The Chief Justice wanted to treat the report like a judicial opinion. It stands for itself, and you don't examine the background of how it was produced. So he was really quiet on the subject completely until the Drew Pearson column was produced in 1967, reporting on these Castro assassination plots that were being discussed within the CIA. And he had to consult with the President Johnson about this subject, and in the course of that educated President Johnson in the findings of the Commission, which was obviously a useful thing to do. So the Chief Justice had never spoken out, but he did speak out, I think, on that occasion, and he spoke out in his memoirs about the experience, and did say that based on his own prosecutorial experience, if the Oswald case had come before him, it would have been a 2 or 3 day murder trial, and that would have been done with the case. And that was also Bill Yossi's assessment as a prosecutor that it was essentially a very simple case, given the volumes of evidence identifying Oswald as the assassin. So in the early years, the Chief Justice was assuring people that the report should stand on its own, and he received a call from Joe Ball, his close friend from California, who complained about the volume of criticism of the work of the commission. And the Chief Justice reportedly told Joe, "Be patient, history will prove us right." And so I think if I had been bolder, I would have suggested a title of "History Has Proven Us Right," but I had to have at least some caveats associated with the book.